there, my name is Sarah Bowen. I'm the artist behind Tiny Things by Bowen, and I'm very excited that you are here today for the Tiny Fandoms class. The only materials that you're going to need today are some kind of clay. I'm using polymer clay. That's my favorite medium. It is an oven-baked clay, and this class is kind of going to be a bit of a Polymer Clay 101 class as well. I'll teach you a lot of basics for that. But if you don't have polymer clay, there's a few other options that you could do. You could use air dry clay, which sits out overnight and hardens. It has more of a foamy texture and you can't get as many details, but it's a good place to start. There's also a paper clay, which is kind of like a paper mache type clay that is a little bit less foamy, so a little more malleable. You can get more details in there, but it's white. So that is something that you could make all in one color and then paint later. And if you have the oven baked clay in all white and you're sad that you don't have colors, that clay takes paint really well after it is cooked. So you're welcome to use a white polymer clay, bake it, let it cool, and then paint it with acrylic paints as well. So whatever kind of clay is going to work for you, that'll be great. I also invite you to bring some clay tools. So they can be traditional clay tools that you bought at the store that were actually labeled clay tools, or they can be things around your house that work for the same kind of purposes. So the most important one for me is a pen tool. It's just a little metal point. If you don't have that, then you can just use a toothpick. That's like a really easy household thing that most of us have that you could use to texture your clay. There's also these little ballpoint tools that have this little metal ball in the end. They work really well for texturing and for blending things. If you don't have that, you could use the rounded end of a paintbrush or some similar tool to get pretty much the same function out of. And then if you're old enough to be trusted with an X-Acto knife, that is something that could be really useful. If not, they make clay tools that kind of look like the knives that aren't as sharp that you could use for that. You could also use your toothpick or your metal tool to cut as well. We'll be doing most of our shaping by hand, so if you don't have the slicing tool or a metal pen tool, that's really no big deal. The other things around the house that you could grab are a toothbrush. That's really good for texture. Or maybe like an old paintbrush that's really hardened and has stiff ends. That can be used for a lot of different things and is a pretty easy thing to find around the house. A couple other tools that I didn't mention in the list that you could play with are chalk pastels. So there's two different kinds of pastels. There's chalk and there's oil. Don't try to use oil, but the chalk pastels can become powdery. And I'll show you how that interacts with polymer clay because you can use it to tint things and it looks really cool. You could also use something like eyeshadow. Basically anything powdered, if you apply it to the clay before you cook it, it's gonna stay. So if you wanna play around with like a gold eyeshadow or like glitter or something like that, you could definitely use that on the clay as an option. You don't have to, but if you wanna play around with it, it's really fun. The last thing that is optional, could help you out if you have it, is hand wipes. I'm going to be using these in between colors because you'll find that the darker pigments will kind of get onto your skin, and I'll show you kind of how to deal with that. But if you don't have hand wipes, no big deal. You can just wash your hands in between colors. The things that we're going to be making today are a firebolt from Harry Potter, the little Mad Hatter hat. I wanted to do a couple literary fandoms since we're doing stuff with the library and we love reading, right? But then I also know that Among Us is really popular and that might be something that you're interested in making, so we're going to make one of those characters. So follow along to make these, but if you do this and you decide, oh yeah, I'm going to do this more on my own, whatever you are setting out to make, get yourself a reference picture. That's going to really help you decide how to go about making it out of clay. Hey, so it's me from the future popping in to say that my class went a little too long and I did have to cut out the frog. So if you want to see how to make these little frogs, go ahead to my YouTube page, which is Tiny Things by Bowen, and you can find a little bit of bonus content there. So the first one that we're going to be doing is the Firebolt from Harry Potter. So you'll notice what I'm doing right now. I'm rolling the clay in my hand. This is called conditioning. So depending on which kind of clay you're using, you'll be able to tell right off from taking it out of the package how squishy it is. If it's polymer clay and it's pretty hard, like that, you're going to want to condition it. So I'm rubbing my hands together like this. I'm creating friction. That's a big part of what warms it up, and you'll see it starts to kind of snake out like that. So just keep doing that. Make sure that your clay is conditioned before you try to use it. Otherwise, you're going to try to make shapes and it's going to be kind of crunchy or crumbly and frustrating. So make sure that you've got it nice and warmed up. If you can pretty easily smush it between two fingers like that, then it's going to be ready to use. So I'm going to be using two different colors of brown as well as a silver. So they do make metallic polymer clay. Word of warning on that is that once you condition the silver, you're going to be really sparkly. So you'll definitely want to clean your hands in between using that and some other color. So once you have your clay conditioned, take a look at the item that you're wanting to make and see how you can break it down into basic shapes. So obviously we have this long stick, and then we have this shape on the broom. A lot of people, when they first start working with polymer clay, think that cutting out shapes will be the best way for them to get something accurate, but our hands are actually really excellent tools for getting the shapes that we want just by sculpting with our fingers. And if you take a look at your fingers where they pinch together, you'll see there is a little right angle in there that is excellent for kind of pinching in the shapes the way you want it. So for me, I think that this Firebolt is really shaped like, if we broke it down, let's say it's like a big triangle that kind of tapers off up into a cylinder up here where it attaches to the stick. And I did already roll out my little stick here. That's pretty basic, right? Make a little snake with a dull end. So I start most of my shaping from a sphere. So just roll yourself a little 3D ball. And then think about if I were to roll it and only put pressure on one side, I'm not really pressing on the other part of the ball, I'm just rolling on the one, it starts to teardrop out like that. So, and then once you do that, you can kind of use your fingers to push and pull and get the shape the way you like it. If you have a reference photo ready, then you can kind of even compare. Like, okay, we're getting kind of close there. Maybe I want to pull this out a little bit. Use my finger to kind of twirl it. I've been doing this for 9 years almost. So while I may make it look very easy, please know that I'm coming from a lot of experience. So if you don't get it on the first try, be willing to try a few times. It's kind of my favorite thing about clay is worst case scenario, it doesn't look right. You smush it and try it again. So I think this is pretty much the basic shape of this part of the broom here. And so now it's time to attach it to the stick. So this part is really important if you want to have really sturdy objects. If you're gonna make something, bake it, and then just put it on the shelf and never touch it again, it's okay if it's not put together in the most sturdy way. So what you do not do, don't ever do this. Don't just stake two pieces and stick them together like this. Two pieces butted up against each other are not very solid because, you know, I could come along and go like that and it falls right off. So sometimes I do test it. So there's a couple options. One, if you want it to be a 2D flat object, so maybe you're turning it into a magnet or even like a pendant that's meant to be worn just facing one way, what you could do is flatten out the little end of the stick like that, and then overlap them like so. So the back does not look perfect, but it doesn't matter because it's not meant to be seen. But say you're making something, maybe an object for a diorama, and you want it to be more 3D, and you want it to look good all the way around. The other option is to dig a little hole. So if you are using a makeshift tool like the end of a paintbrush, you can use that, or you can use one of the ballpoint tools. But basically, we're just gonna hollow out a little hole and then plant the stick right inside of there. So now all the way around, it looks nice. And you'll notice some kind of wrapping right here, that if you wanted to go in and take maybe a little bit of yellow or something and kind of wrap it, I love to think about what would it feel like or look like in real life, and if that was like maybe leather or something wrapped around the handle, then it would look like a flat piece wrapped around. So I'm going to take a little snake, flatten it out, and just kind of wrap it around this part like that. Kind of roll it flat. I think that looks pretty cool. I don't know what that actually is, but that's what I decided to interpret it as. So now it is time to get some texture into the actual broom itself. If you have a metal pen tool, this is where it's going to come in really handy. If you don't, then go ahead and use a toothbrush, or no, go ahead and use a toothpick. And we're just going to go in and add a bunch of texture in here. Notice that it only goes up to about this point, and then it gets wrapped in the silver. So I'm going to texture it all up. I am going to make this 2D, so I'm not worried about texturing the back. If you decide you want to texture the back, sometimes I like to let it kind of sit, and then I can flip it and do the back without smushing the front. So you can do that, just maybe give it a minute so you don't turn it over and immediately ruin all of your details there. So I find that the deeper in that you go, the more distinct the texture is. Now, if you're using a really thin piece of clay, be careful to not just scratch all the way through it. And then it's got all of these little frizzy parts down here, where the little straw or whatever is made, the broom is made of, kind of frays out at the end. The thing with polymer clay is teeny tiny little things like that are not going to be very strong. They could definitely break. So I'm not going to do the frizzies, but I am going to kind of rough up the bottom. And maybe you can tell I'm just kind of poking my tool in there and stabbing and scraping very unceremoniously. I rarely aim for perfection. It's not a good plan. It's very hard to achieve. So I'm just poking my tool in there, and you can just kind of stop when it feels like, oh, that looks nice and rough. And notice that my handle's been kind of like flopping all over the place. I'll show you when we go to cook it how to kind of double check that it's going to be seated in the right angle to bake the way you want it. But for now, I think we are ready to go in and add these silver bits. If you wanted to do some kind of texture in the handle itself, you're welcome to do that. I think I may just go in and kind of see how it's a little bit rough and not like perfectly smooth. I'm just going to go in with a tool and kind of press around in there. So I like that. I think that makes it look a little bit more realistic. Maybe I'll point the end a little bit more like it is in the picture there. I think that'll be good. And so now for this metallic color. If you want it to be a really functional thing, so like essentially a toy, something that you're going to play with, move around, maybe you're gonna have a little diorama that you mess with, I would not make these long footholds out of clay, because like I said, those long skinny pieces are pretty breakable. So think about, what do you have around the house that you could put on there to look like that? I think a paper clip would be a really good option. Maybe trim it into halves, or even put the whole thing straight through there and then bend it into the shapes that you want, because that's actual metal. It's going to hold up really well. So just think about it. Think about what you want it to, how you want it to function in the end. For me, I think I'm gonna make a magnet. It's gonna go up on the fridge. I don't have kids in my house that might knock it over and break it, so I feel confident that I could go ahead and make these little pieces out of clay and it'll be okay. But I'm gonna start by doing these little parts that wrap around it. So I have taken a snake and flattened it out. I'm gonna come up here on the top one first, and I'm not sure if you'll be able to see in the camera here, but I am very sparkly now because I was touching that. So depending on if you're doing 3D or 2D, maybe you want to wrap it all the way around. I personally don't care what the back looks like, so I'm just going to trim it and kind of tuck it right back there, like that. And then we'll need a little bit thinner of one down a little way, so I'll do that again. I'll make a snake. I'll flatten it, come over here and affix it. Trim it with a little extra. And if you don't have, again, if you don't have this X-Acto knife tool, you could be using your fingernail to trim it or even your toothpick. So I've got the two little wrappings on there, and now I want to add the little footholds because I know that I'm not going to be touching this a lot when it's done, and it's okay for them to be a little bit fragile. So I'm going to roll out a snake. You can tell I start from that kind of snake idea all the time. I'm going to think about how I want it shaped. Maybe you don't have to get all of those, like here's the foothold, here's a little line, now it goes up. Maybe you just get the general idea, especially because we're making things small. Don't worry about getting every single tiny little detail in there. And remember, the two different ways of attaching something, I'm going to overlap on this one. I'm going to make it, I'm going to flatten out the bottom. I'll show you again on this side, it'll be a little easier to see. I roll out my snake. I get the basic shape that I want. Have it come back this way. And then I'm going to flatten this little piece here and squish it right on, like that. So I kind of jumped right in and I didn't talk anything about our surface. I'm using a ceramic tile. If you decide that you really want to get into polymer clay and you do want to build up the tools that you need for success, these ceramic tiles you can get at like Lowe's or Home Depot for like a couple of dollars. In my own practice, I often use the small 4x4 tiles because I can do one project, pop that in the oven while I work on my next project. But you don't have to have a tile. You could be working directly on a wooden surface as long as it is nice and smooth. You could be using like a plastic placemat. Don't work on paper because paper sucks the oils out of the clay and makes it harder. And don't try to work on something cloth, like a tablecloth, because it'll get little fuzzies in your clay and the clay can actually dye the tablecloth colors. So make sure you're working on a nice hard surface. And then when it comes time to bake, if you have a ceramic tile, you can just bake the ceramic tile. That's probably my favorite part about working on them. But if you do not have one, just get a regular old cookie sheet and put down a piece of foil so that you don't ruin the surface. You can still cook on it later. And then put your piece on the foil and then bake it. I'm going to go ahead and put mine on a small ceramic tile. So when you're lifting it up off the surface, be really gentle. Get your stick lined up just the way you like it. If you feel like the stick kind of slouches or droops, you can actually build up a little foil bed for it to lay on. You can always make foil supports and things to make sure that your clay doesn't fall over or droop in the oven. So if you need to build a little platform for it to sit on underneath, you can do that. And the next one that we're going to do is the Mad Hatter's hat. So for me, I really loved Alice in Wonderland growing up. It was kind of hard to guess what teens and you preteens were into now, but I think that it's fairly universal whether you love the movie or the book. And I have decided that I'm going to make mine out of blue just because. And as I'm warming this up, I want to take a look at my reference photo and think, how can I break this up into individual shapes That is always going to help you with no matter what you're making. If you can think about how does this break up into shapes, it's going to make it a lot easier for you. So for the hat, I see a cylinder that kind of tapers up as it gets higher. And around the bottom, like, yeah, technically it is a circle with a hole in it. But often I see people say, oh, if I make a hat, it has to be hollow. It does not. Nobody's actually going to be putting your tiny hat on. We can just pretend that it's hollow on the inside. So maybe that circle on the bottom is really just a snake around the outside. Think about ways you can make it a little bit easier on yourself, because it doesn't have to be that realistic. I'm going to put a little bit of this aside for the brim of my hat. For the cylinder shape, again, I'm starting with a sphere, and I'm going to roll out just one side of it. If it's hard for you to do in your hand, maybe you do it this way, maybe do it with your fingers. If that is still hard, you could try it on your work surface. Take your sphere, press down, see how my fingers are angling down, and I'm not touching this side. Try to get this little slightly teardrop shaped ball like that. But now we want to flatten the top and the bottom. So there's a couple ways you can do it. You can do it in your fingers like this. Depending on how soft your clay is, it might just completely smush your shape. So you can go around with your other fingers and kind of perfect that shape a little bit like that. You could also have set it on the table and kind of flattened it down that way. And then say you want this top, the top of the top hat, to be a little bit crisper of a line. That's where these pincher fingers come in. So I can go around the top corner of it and pinch a little bit, and that just gives us a nice crisp edge. And work with it until you're happy with it. There's no reason, if you're like, oh, it's not quite right, there's no reason not to try it again. Just work until you like it. So for the brim of the hat, you have a couple of different options. Like I said, you could do a sphere and flatten it into a circle like that, and just kind of place them, obviously that one's not perfect, but kind of place it on top like that. Or you can go in and make yourself a flat snake, and I think that's what I'm going to do in this instance. So say I have this nice flat snake, but I have a really wobbly edge here. A couple of options to help straighten it up a little bit. If you have a blade that you could kind of tap along there and clean it up, straighten it out. You could also use your toothpick, just butt it up against the edge and press, and that'll help you get a nice crisp line. I'm actually going to slice the little end off so that it's got a nice flat space to connect. And I'm going to line it up right here like this. And it is overlapping a little bit. Remember, it's not just butted up against the side. And I'm going to wrap it around, making sure that it's overlapping on the bottom, at least a little bit. And then when we get back around to where it connects, I'm going to cut that one. You can use your toothpick, you can use your nail if you don't have a knife. I'm going to let it overlap a little bit like that. So that doesn't look perfect, but what you can do when you have seams or where two pieces of clay have come together and you really want to smooth it out, there are a few options. You could use your toothpick or your pen tool to just kind of smooth, push the clay over. You can moisten your finger just a tiny bit. Do not be mixing a lot of water into this clay, it will weaken it. But if you're at home where germs are safe and no big deal, you could actually just barely lick your finger, get that tiny bit of moisture on there. We're going to bake it off anyway, it'll be okay. And just kind of smooth out where they overlapped. I think I'm happy with that. I think that's pretty cute. So if you want to go in and shape it, see how this one kind of has the curve on the bottom based on how it's being looked at. Maybe in all of my smushing, I've kind of lost that crisp edge on the top of the hat. So I'm going to go around and get that a little bit nicer. Maybe you're going to flip it like that, get it the way you like. it's not tapered anymore because I've messed with it. So I'm just taking my time, going around and kind of squeezing in that inside, the bottom part where the hat tapers down. So for the little ribbon detail on the hat, I'm gonna stay monochromatic. I'm gonna use a darker version of the blue. If you want to play around with mixing your colors, you know what, I'll actually just show you that right now. Say I want something that's in between this dark blue and this light blue. We can mix them together. So just like in acrylic paint or oil paint, the dark color is going to take over faster or more. So if we want in between, I did a little bit more light blue than I did dark blue. And watch how I just start kneading it. I'm kind of smushing. This is only possible if it's really well conditioned. This is really fresh clay. If yours is not quite as soft, you could be rolling it out into snakes and then twisting and then smushing it back up. You can also stop halfway. Like right now I'm mixing to a whole new color, but if you decided that you wanted that marbly texture, you could stop mixing partway through and have a really pretty swirl to work with. But I continued mixing, and you can see here's the two colors, and here's my little in-between color now. So you can always mix colors, play with it. Maybe you bought a sample pack of clay and it doesn't have all the colors that you need. Do a little bit of research on color theory, color combinations, and learn what do you need to mix to get that. So I'm flattening this out. I'm kind of stretching it to either side so that it gets a little bit thicker, like that. And then I'm going to wrap it around the bottom of the hat. Notice I didn't go in and make the edges perfect because, in my opinion, it's a ribbon and they're not going to be super crisp and perfect. But I'm going to go wrap it around the bottom of the hat here. And I am going to slice off one end, wrap it, and slice off the other end right where they meet so they don't have a big overlap. What is kind of easy about the little Mad Hatter hat is his little, I don't even know what it's for, the little card that he keeps in there. And I'm just going to use that card to cover the seam on my ribbon. I'm not even going to bother trying to smooth it out. So instead of trying to smooth out that seam, I'm just going to hide it. Nobody will know it's back there. Now, notice I am using my hand wipes in between these colors because especially that dark blue got pigment all over my fingers, and I'm about to switch over to a lighter color. I'm going to be using this light yellow. So I have this little ball of clay here, and instead of rolling it out and trying to cut out a square, I'm going to shape a square with my finger. So I flattened a sphere. I have this little flat circle now, and I'm going to go in and use this pincher angle on my fingers to pinch each corner. So notice I'm keeping it in this hand that I used to squish. I'm coming in with interlocking fingers. I'm not doing it this way, I'm doing it this way. And I'm just pressing in that corner. So I have a nice crisp corner. I'm going to turn it, keep it in my pinching fingers, come in here, get that angle. So I've got two pretty good little corners on there. And turn it around again. Just play around with it. If you absolutely have to smush it out and cut it, that's okay. Sometimes we have to make do and move on. If you do that and you're having trouble getting it up off of your work surface, you can use any kind of little tool. Go just get barely under the corner and then just scratch it off of there like that. And I'm going to go in and lay it right on top of that seam. And now we need to get in the little numbers. So writing with clay is tricky. If you want to bake the clay and then use acrylic paint and a little bitty paintbrush later to paint on your details, you're more than welcome to do that. I often do that with my own work. But I wanted to show you that it is possible to do something so tiny and tedious with the clay itself. So I'm going to roll out some little bitty black snakes here. So this is where I like having an actual blade instead of a toothpick, because you can make really precise cuts. But I'm going to cut this little line for the 1 on the tin. And then often when you're cutting with the tools, the clay sticks to the tools. Use that to your advantage to place it. So I'm going to come in and cut a long snake like that and go in and put that on his, as the little fraction line here. If you ever notice that your clay is sticking to your fingers really badly, it gets frustrating when you're working on a really tedious scale like this, like trying to make these numbers and having the little snake stick to your fingers. It's probably time to clean your fingers, because if you have pigment on there, that means there's actually kind of a clay buildup, and that is making you sticky. So go wash your hands, let them dry, come back and try the tedious part again. So for this little 6, I'm going to take my tiny little snake like that. I'm going to bring one end up to meet in the middle like that. It's not perfect, that's okay. Kind of get it shaped about the way you like it. That's pretty much a 6 right there. And then I'm going to come over, use the fact that it is stuck to my pen tool, and come over and stick it onto the clay and press it down, make sure it's well stuck. I like that. For my 0, I'm not positive how long of a snake I'm going to need. So instead of cutting it first, I'm going to wrap it up into a 0 like that, and then cut the end, just so that I know I have a long enough piece. Because sometimes you can't really guess what it's going to look like once it's curled. I had to turn it around. I'm sorry that the camera can't see it. There we go. I think that I like that. And then, you know, in handling it, I've kind of misshapen the hat part again. So go around, make sure I'm not using my fingers that have the black pigment on them. And I'm stretching that top out again. You can also go in and add teeny tiny details with paint later. But I think I'm happy with my hat. And we are going to start on our little Among Us character. The Among Us characters are really fun because you can go in and add all of the little accessories and outfits and things that you get to play with in the game. You could also, if you're familiar with the game, you know that the little dead ones are missing their top and have a little bone sticking out. That's kind of a fun thing to play around with. Think about the shapes if you're going to do that. And I'm actually going to make mine pretty tiny because I'm going to show you 2 different options on how to shape their legs. So the first way that I'm going to show you how to make them is by kind of pulling out their little legs. This is going to be the way that is the most sturdy, but it might be a little bit hard, so I'll show you in other ways as well. I'm going to save a little bit of this red out for his little backpack or his jetpack, whatever he's wearing there. And I'm going to start to shape it down into that, maybe a jelly bean is the best way to describe that kind of shape that he is there. And then we're going to use those pincher fingers that I talked about, get that angle, go in and just start by pinching out 2 little legs. So it's almost like I pinched and then I kind of pulled to get those started. But we want them to be pretty circular. They're not like flat legs. They're short little stubby things. So take your time, see if you can kind of get them the way you like them. And you can actually, if you're doing it, so this one that I'm working on right now is 3D, so it's all the way around. Maybe make the legs a little longer than they need to be. I'm kind of pulling them out a little bit further so that then I can go and smoosh it onto my tile so that I know it will be able to stand up after it's baked. If you have a hard time pulling the feet out of there, I'm going to show you another option. This option is going to look better as a 2D object, so that means it doesn't go all the way around, and you won't need a backpack because you won't be able to see the back. So the clay that I pulled out is going to be for the legs themselves. So I'm going to have a little bit of clay left over, and I'm going to get the basic shape of the body without the legs. Roll out my sphere, start to get that jelly bean shape. If that's easier for you to roll it on your surface to get it, that's fine. and maybe just kind of flatten out the bottom a little bit. And I'm going to press down to make it 2D. So this would be excellent as a magnet or a charm or a button. So the other option with the legs is to make two little kind of tic-tac sized. And now remember, we are not going to just stick them together like that. Two pieces of clay against each other like this are definitely going to fall apart. What we are going to do is have our little leg. We're going to smush down one side of it. I'm going to do them both at the same time, like so. And then come and smush the body down right on top of it. So like I said, this isn't going to look quite as nice. You're going to be able to see the line where the two pieces of clay have come together, but it's a great place to start. So if you had a hard time doing this, just do this and move forward. You're going to improve as you go. Don't be frustrated. So I've grabbed this little piece of clay that I had left over from this 3D one, and I am shaping it into the little jetpack. So I'm going to take a sphere, smush it a little bit flat, not super flat, and go in, much like we did on the paper for the hat, and pinch those corners. But because it's so thick still, I can actually pinch two corners at once. So I can go in, do that, turn it, do that again, flatten it, kind of get the shape that I like. So here's an instance where we are just going to put two pieces of clay together, but it's their entire surface. It's going to be really sturdy. If your clay is warm, so both of my pieces are still warm, I just sculpted this, I can safely stick it on the back, give him his little jetpack like that, and it worked great. If, say, you made this piece yesterday and you're coming back to add the details today, what you should do is, it's called score, and that means you go in with your toothpick or your pen tool, you scratch up one side, you scratch up the other piece that you're connecting it to, right where you're going to put them, and then stick them together. Those scratched up pieces are going to help the clay stick together like this in the oven. But as long as it's nice and warmed up, you're going to be fine. So I'm going to get all this pigment off of my hands to move on to making his little visor. So for the visors, I grabbed a little piece of blue here. Do whatever color you want. Maybe you want to do a lighter blue. Maybe you want to do darker and then put a lighter on top for all of that detail. I'm not going to do that because I know that the differences in colors are there because of shadows. And when we're making a 3D object, those are going to happen naturally. But I'm going to roll out a little tic-tac for both of them, like so. And then because the face shield is kind of domed, it kind of goes up like this, I'm not going to flatten it out before I put it on. Because this is domed, I'm going to pick up that 3D little tic-tac and just lay it on like that and let it stick up. Same with this one. Press it on there, everything's warm, they're going to stick just fine. If I come over here and try to smack this off, it's going to stay, this one's going to stay. And there we go, we have a little Among Us character. Maybe in looking at this 2D one, I do want to go in and add like a tiny bit of white on there. If you're working with white, clean your hands. Even if you can't see pigment on there, there's pigment on there. So really just scrub your little fingerprints, get that out of there, and then go in and touch the white. Roll it up in that little shape, drape it across the top. And I want to get that one pretty flat. So there's a couple little Among Us characters. If you're going to be adding maybe like bows or outfits or whatever, break those into shapes. A bow is really just two triangles with a circle in the middle. Think about what goes into that object and it's going to help you recreate it. I hope that whether you followed along and made these things with me today or whether you just learned about the polymer clay and you're preparing to do your own little fandom creatures or your own ideas, I hope that this has helped you gain some confidence in working with the clay, and just remember to be willing to try multiple times. When you go to bake your items, you need to follow the directions on the package. You can bake it directly on your tile, or you can put it on a cookie sheet with a piece of aluminum foil. Bake it for the appropriate amount of time and then let it cool off all the way before you handle it. The clay is much more breakable when it's warm, like fresh out of the oven. You know, if I were to like try to pull this up off of the tile, then I could very likely break it unless I waited. Once it's all the way cooled off, it's gonna pop right off of the tile all in one piece. So thank you so much for playing with clay with me today, and if you want to share some of the stuff you made, share it to your local library page. I'll be scoping those out, and I had a lot of fun with you today. I hope to see you again for another class. Thank you!